All right. Well, now I was nervous enough because it's been forever since I've been here. I was hoping I remembered how to do one of these. And now I have to explain why I'm an expert. I got 118 high school students that'll tell you that I'm not. So, but um, no, it's really, really nice to be back here. Sorry it took me so long to come up with a new story for you. Had a wonderful bout of a broken laptop and all sorts of other things that kind of conspired against me. But yeah, I supposedly teach high school history. That's my goal every day when I go into school. And so what do history teachers do when they're off work? They teach more history. Some people tell me I need a hobby, but my hobby is Great Lakes shipwreck stories. And this one, um, I'm actually talking about three different shipwrecks. One of them I have already mentioned to you in a past talk. If you were at my 1913 storm talk, I have mentioned the Leafield in the past. But these three ships are are connected in more ways than even I knew when I started my research. And I called this talk Queens of Industry because as I got into my research, this became much more than a Great Lakes shipwreck story. It became kind of a crosscut of the growth of American industrialization at the same time. Now, you might notice I have three ships listed on the title slide here, but I have four pictures. I know I teach history, but I can count a little bit. I will tie in the fourth ship at some point. But I want to start with the first boat here, the Monkshaven. I've talked not necessarily about this particular ship here before, but the storm that wrecked it. If you were here for my 1905 Lake Superior storm talk, um, I'm going to mention that storm again. But the Monkshaven is a really interesting story. When she comes to the Great Lakes, it is a whole new era of uh, shipping, not just on the Great Lakes, but across the Atlantic Ocean, because for the first time, the Monkshaven, this actual vessel right here, is the first ship to take finished American steel from Ohio to Great Britain in 1900. At the height of the Industrial Revolution, when Great Britain is the kingpin of steel manufacturing, she's going to take the first American steel right over to be direct competition with Great Britain. So she's going to actually use the new St. Lawrence Canal to leave Ohio and go over to England and deliver American steel. And then she's going to make trips back, bringing imported goods on her way back. And that really was Andrew Carnegie's thought process. After he started the Carnegie Steel Company, he wanted to spread out and sell his steel in more places than just the United States. And it's the Monkshaven that starts it, brings the very first load over to England. She has, in her days of crossing the Atlantic Ocean, she has her usual stories, including a collision over in a river in England. She was found to be not at fault there, but she does run into another ship. And she has quite a trip crossing the Atlantic and coming back to the United States, where the lifeboats are washed away, the bridge works are washed off, cabins are flooded. She basically barely survives this North Atlantic storm on her way back to the United States. In 1900, we're going to have old names and new beginnings for four ships. And I should mention, if you look at these four pictures, these four ships look very, very similar. And I forgot my disclaimer at the start of the talk. There are going to be times in this talk you're going to think I lost track of where I'm at and I'm repeating myself. I'm not. I titled this, in the title, I put the Entangled Tales, and these four ships are constantly following the same storyline. But they are actually going to get put on on dedicated runs between the Great Lakes and Great Britain in the steel trade. So the 4 ships that we're talking about are the Monkshaven, the Theano, the Leafield, and I think I'm pronouncing it correctly, but the Paliki. If I'm not pronouncing it correctly, I don't teach English, I teach history. But they are going to be on a dedicated run for the Carnegie steel plants, crossing the Atlantic, hauling that steel. And 2 years later, in 1902, all 4 of them get sold to the Algoma Steamship Company. And they will still cross the Atlantic at times, but they're going to be put on more dedicated Great Lakes runs, sailing for Algoma. And interestingly, of all 4 ships, none of them have their name changed. Now, that might be the superstition because some people claim it's bad luck to change the name of a ship. But pretty typically, when a ship is sold to a new company, the new company gives it a new name. And all 4 ships maintain their original name, even though they're sold to Algoma. So the Monkshaven is going to go to work here on the Great Lakes. She has her typical bumps and bruises of a ship working on the Great Lakes at the turn of the century. At one point, she's trying to leave through the St. Lawrence Canal, head over to England, and found out that she had loaded too much steel and was sitting 10 inches too deep in the water to make it out. So she had to get a little bit of help there to get off a sandbar, but no damage. At one point, she has to go in for repairs because she managed to hit a bridge abutment. So she has to go get some steel plates replaced. And the bane of every ship on the Great Lakes, ice. She's going to get stuck in the ice. She's going to be pushed to ground by ice windrows. Nothing unusual for a steamer on the Great Lakes in the early 1900s. Then the Monkshaven has maybe one of the funniest stories I've ever come across. One of her sailors was arrested, not for counterfeiting, but for trying to change a $1 bill into a $2 bill, and tried to pay his streetcar fare with it. And so the federal authorities tracked him down to the Monkshaven and arrested him and hauled him away. Fast forward to 1905, November 28th, the Monkshaven is leaving Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario, and heading up to what at this point is called Fort William. Today we call it Thunder Bay, Ontario, but it's the Fort William, Port Arthur area of northern Lake Superior. And she runs into a pretty hefty gale. This is the storm that is commonly called the Matapha storm. If you were at my 1905 talk, and I really focused on that wreck that was pushed ashore right at the Duluth Piers, in the same storm, the Monkshaven gets caught up here. And in the course of the storm, she winds up going aground right here on Pie Island. Now, she's overdue at Fort William. She's heading there to get a load of grain. And so when she becomes overdue, obviously people are worried that she has been lost. And when you look at this news article, I don't know, is it covered by the, nope, it's right over there, just to the left of the subtitles. Look at this, look at the ship that it was traveling behind. It's her sister ship, the Paliki. So one of her sister ships that she was sold to the Great Lakes with is traveling with her. The Paliki arrives at Fort William. The Monkshaven does not. And people are concerned that perhaps she's been lost with all hands. She was not. She went aground on Pie Island, and this is how she was found. Safe, but definitely not okay. So the crew, actually, no one is lost in this particular grounding. The crew is able to abandon ship. They get over onto the island where they spend a very cold 48 to 96 hours. Sources kind of differ on that, but they do get off the boat onto the island because they're really afraid the ship's going to break up in the waves once it's on the rocks. They do find shelter, and I came across 2 stories here. Some newspapers claim that there was an old ramshackle, abandoned shack, house, whatever you want to call it, and they were able to get in there. Some sources said they made a shelter out of tree branches. They were able to make some shelter. They were able to start a small fire, at least to keep from freezing to death. But the stress of the situation, the second mate actually went temporarily insane until they were picked up by a passing ship and brought into safety. But again, no one was lost in this particular incident. But what about the ship itself? Well, a lot of people thought the Monkshaven was just going to be done, that she was going to be too badly damaged. Turns out, no, because in 1906, there is a very famous salvager named Tom Reed. And if it can be fixed, if it can be salvaged, Reed can do it. And so he's going to come up the next year. They weren't able to get the ship off the rocks by the end of 1905. Keep in mind, it's the end of November. Ice is coming pretty quick. Not time to get all the equipment out there that far into Lake Superior. So she spends the winter on Pie Island. We get to 1906. Tom Reed shows up with his wrecking crews, and they're going to pull the Monkshaven off the rocks. After some significant surveys, when you see a ship like this, you got to think maybe it's not safeable, but turns out it is. And Reed's going to get the Monkshaven afloat, and so he pulls it off the island and he anchors it off the island so they can do a little bit more patchwork on it. And the idea is they're going to tow it to Duluth, to the shipyard there to be fixed up. Mother Nature can throw anybody's plans into the garbage can, more so when you're on the water. Guess what? Another storm comes up and breaks the Monkshaven loose from the temporary moorings that Reed has put it on. This time she's not going to be saved. She actually washes up on Angus Island this time. So not even the same island. And this time the Monkshaven simply can't be saved. And that's where she's going to stay for a number of years. Some sources say that she was just abandoned there. The wreck is not on the island anymore. It is all completely underwater. Some sources say that just with ice and waves that it kind of beaten to pieces. Some sources claim that after a while, upwards of 12 years later, authorities came in and dynamited the wreck. I can't confirm either one. What I can tell you is that the wreck looks like confetti at the bottom of very shallow water. So it is completely dismantled and not up on the island anymore. How it got that way is open to some conjecture. So that's how the Monkshaven actually ends up meeting its demise, is almost a year after it runs on Pie Island. Then we get to the Theano. Yeah.
These are steel hull.
Yes. So the question is, they are steel hulled ships. Yes. All four of them are steel hulled.
Silly question, but why would you dynamite something like that? You spread debris all over the place. Why not just leave it?
Yeah. Why dynamite the wreck? Typically, that's not an uncommon thing to do. If the wreck is in shallow water and it's a hazard to navigation. Being up on the island like that, I would question that it was a hazard in navigation, because if you're hitting, you saw the pictures, if you hit that shipwreck, then you're not where you should have been. So I don't know. And I have exhausted all the sources at my disposal, and I can't find any articles that talk about dynamiting the wreck. The archive here in town, their file on this boat says that it may have been. So I'm still trying to actually confirm that it was dynamited at all. And if they did, I'm going to ask the same question.
So you're implying more for navigation.
Yeah, usually when a wreck is dynamited, it's for navigational purposes. But again, this thing was up on the island. No one was going to hit this one if they were on course. So I've got some questions on that one too. When you get back to the turn of the century like this, some of the details are a little sketchy. And so I'm still working on some of the finer points there. So then we get to the Theano. And the Theano, each one of these vessels was the first to do something which I thought was really cool. The Theano is the first vessel to take Canadian iron ore from Lake Superior. So we, the United States, had been hauling iron ore for quite some time. Canada had started opening iron ore mines as that was discovered along the north shore of Lake Superior. And it's the Theano that's going to take the very first load of Canadian iron ore out of Lake Superior, heading to Midland, Ontario, over on Georgian Bay. 1902, she actually gets to play the hero. So there's a gale on Lake Erie, and the schooner Bar is going to be lost, but no sailors are lost because before the ship sinks, the crew is taken off by the Theano. So she gets to play the hero for a little bit. She rescues the crew of the Bar. And then we go back to Lake Superior. Does this slide look a little familiar? I will admit this particular presentation might have been the easiest to put together because I could keep reusing slides. The Theano is leaving Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario, and they are heading to Fort William, Ontario. On November 17th, 1906, runs into a storm, gets caught in a storm out there, and gets in a blinding snow and ends up running on Trowbridge Island, which, as you can tell, is basically right across the bay from Pie Island, where the Monkshaven went and where it's still sitting on Angus Island. The crew barely escapes with their lives. It's quite the story. So in a blinding snow, they go on the rocks, they hit the island. The crew stayed aboard for a good 2 hours until the ship started to disintegrate around them. And so they managed to abandon ship in the lifeboats. And if you think about that, your ship is pounding in the surf on the rocks. It is a Lake Superior storm. Lowering the lifeboats is not an easy task to do. And they managed to do it using both lifeboats, part of the crew in each one, and they row away. And the headline says crew barely escapes with their lives because a matter of minutes after they row away in the lifeboats, the boilers explode. The cold water had gotten in the engine room, they hit the boilers, and hot boilers and cold water don't mix. And they exploded, and the Theano slides off the rocks and sinks into deep water. Nobody is lost in this accident either. The one lifeboat is picked up fairly quickly by a passing steamer, the Iroquois, and taken into Port Arthur. The other lifeboat, no one finds it, and they wind up rowing half a day into Port Arthur. But they did it. Nobody is lost. The Theano is sunk in deep water because when the boilers exploded, she wasn't lodged on the rocks good enough to stay there. So she was pulled off the rocks and sank in about 310 feet of water, where in 2004, she was finally found. And that's what she looks like now. I wish I could share some pictures with you, but I wasn't able to contact the person to get permission. It was really interesting. Just a couple months ago on Facebook, I saw pictures of this particular wreck. There was a gentleman got a ride down to it in a submarine that is aboard the cruise ships that come in here to Alpena. A lot of people don't realize those are also scientific vessels, and they have a pair of submarines on board. And this guy got him. I don't know how he managed it. He got him to give him a ride in a submarine down to this shipwreck, and I'm really jealous. I want to talk to these people. I want a submarine ride next. So the Theano, that wreck was found. Again, it's in deep water. And that's really kind of where the Theano story ends, because everybody survived. The ship is gone. You're not going to salvage it from 300 feet of water. Which brings us to the Leafield. And the Leafield, like I said, I've mentioned this one before in my 1913 talk, but I mentioned it in passing. I really focused on some of the other wrecks. The Leafield, I said every one of these boats was the first to do something. But before the Leafield gets to be a record setter, it has one heck of a year in 1901. In 1901, Great Lakes ships, it's kind of like bumper cars. They're going to run into things. They're going to get some bumps and bruises. The Leafield took it to another level. In May of 1901, it manages to catch fire in the engine room. And so the engine room is significantly damaged, and they have to go to the shipyard for repairs. It gets fixed up from the fire, goes back to work, and promptly runs aground in the St. Clair Flats. Fortunately, no damage anyway, just an inconvenience of having to have a tugboat come pull them out of the mud. They go back about their business, and they manage to run into a pier in the Welland Canal, where she's going to have to go back to the dry dock and have 6 new steel plates replaced in her bow. That is an interesting year in and of itself, but it gets better. One interesting headline that I don't see very often is about a boat's fuel running out. The Leafield was underway from Buffalo to Cleveland in the middle of Lake Erie, towing a barge, which was the norm for the day. Right, these steamers would pull 2, 3, sometimes even 4 barges, typically old schooners that had been cut down. In the gale, right, she's fighting against the storm, she's sailing into the waves, she's pulling this extra barge. To keep the steam up, they had used so much fuel, they were in danger of running out of coal for the boilers in the middle of the lake. They were off Ashtabula, but the weather was rough enough they couldn't safely make it into that port. So the Leafield has to drop the barge to anchor out in the middle of the lake to lighten the load on her and make her run for Cleveland and hope the fuel held out. And she makes it there. Personally, I'm kind of wondering about the poor guys on the barge. Like, that's got to be an uncomfortable feeling. You're in the middle of the storm, you're in an unpowered barge, and they just cut the tow line. These guys knew what to do. That was the standard action to take in a situation like that, but I'm still just picturing being on an unpowered ship in a storm, and the one that's towing me through the storm just leaves me there. The Leafield barely makes it to Cleveland. Some of the articles even talked about how they actually did run out of coal or almost ran out of coal, and they had to supplement the boiler fires with the woodwork from the cabins to make it in. So they do make it to Cleveland, minus the barge. So they unload, get some more coal, and then they have to go back out and go get the barge that they left. But you just don't see a whole lot of stories about ships running out of gas in the middle of the lake, or coal in this case. So 1901 was a pretty interesting year for the Leafield. In 1906, the Leafield is going to take the very first load of iron ore from Escanaba to go north. There had been ore coming out of Escanaba for a while, but it all went south. This is the first load of Escanaba ore to go north through the Sioux Locks. I didn't know any of this when I started the research. So to find something, each one of these boats was the first to do something, I thought was kind of a really neat thing. Then we get to 1912, and it's never good when the headlines read "ashore and full of water." That's a problem. Turns out she ran on Lonely Island in Georgian Bay, right about where this X is. Lonely Island, not a good place to run ashore. And interestingly, this wasn't a storm. The newspapers were conspicuously lacking in details on what happened. What they did say is that the captain was well regarded in the maritime community, and a lot of people would be kind of sad for him that he had this misfortune. So the way I interpret that is that there was a navigational error, and they just simply sailed onto an island. I could be wrong. Again, there aren't a whole lot of details about this, but that's how I read it. When you start seeing news articles that talk about how good of a sailor the captain is, and they're not telling you why it wound up on an island, fill in the gaps. Well, this is a different trip. So he wound up in Georgian Bay. This is several years after the trip through the Sioux Locks with the Escanaba ore. And so the best I can come up with is he just simply made a navigational error, or one of his mates did, and they crashed into an island. And by crashed, I mean crashed hard. She's going to have 16 steel plates uh, renewed, replaced, and 30 feet of her stem rebuilt. That is a whole lot of steel to have to replace and rebuild for one accident. But the Leafield survives to sail again, which takes us back to Lake Superior. I did tell you, it might seem like I'm repeating myself, but I'm really not. It's now 1913, and the Leafield is leaving from Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario, and going to Fort William, Ontario. Oh, by the way, she's carrying the same load as the Theano. They were both carrying railroad rails. So even carrying the same cargo as one of the other ships. So here we go. We're going to travel up Lake Superior again, going to the same place. And she's going to run into the king of storms. And again, if you were here for my 1913 storm talk, that was the storm of all storms. The Leafield, it's well known, but it sort of gets overshadowed by a lot of the other wrecks of this storm. So she's heading up to Fort William with her cargo of railroad rails, and she never makes port. She just doesn't arrive. So where is she? Now, this storm, like I said, it hit 4 of the 5 Great Lakes. It sank at least one ship on 4 of the 5 Great Lakes. 8 steel ore carriers on Lake Huron alone in a 4-hour period. This was a massive storm. So it takes time for people to figure out who's missing, who's not. Other ships are 2-3 days late arriving, but they do arrive. So trying to sort out what happened in this storm takes people several days. So obviously there's a fear that the Leafield has sunk with all hands. It takes a while for the storm to settle down and for any sort of search to begin. And then it starts feeling like deja vu all over again, because word comes in that the Leafield is aground on Angus Island and that the crew may be safe, maybe not, not sure. But the report comes in from the captain of another ship that he has seen the Leafield on the rocks on Angus Island. So as quickly as they can, they dispatch a tugboat out there to go offer any assistance they can. When the tugboat arrives, all they find is the wreck of the Monkshaven that was left there in 1906. No Leafield. So where is it? Right? Now it's pretty evident the Leafield is gone and that the crew of 26 is gone with her. The third wreck I'm talking about is the first one where we're going to lose sailors. And so there's some debate as to, was it on the island? Was it not? Did the captain of this passing ship actually see the Monkshaven? Because when we were at the slide where I had all four ships pictures up there, they all look very similar. They're all roughly the same size. There's not a whole lot, especially in the middle of a storm. It's going to be hard to differentiate between the 4. Did he actually see the Leafield, or did he see the wreck of the Monkshaven and make a mistake? We don't know. But when you read the story of the Leafield, and I read a whole bunch of books on the 1913 storm, everything I read talks about the Leafield going up on Angus Island. And here's the news article about it. So Captain Foote of the passenger steamship Harmonic is the guy who claims to have seen the Leafield on Angus Island. So when the tugboat went out to go look for her and she was gone, either he made a mistake, or it's a scenario like the Theano where it flooded and was pulled back off the rocks and sank in deep water. Every book I have read on this particular storm talks about the Leafield going on Angus Island, getting pulled off, and sinking in deep water. Then I found a different news article that talks about Captain Baird of the Harmonic claiming to have seen the steamer Leafield sink. He claims that he saw the Leafield ride up to the crest of a wave and do a nosedive and sink. Well, that would change the story a little bit. But I have a problem here. Different captains, same boat. Captain Foote and Captain Baird, both on the Harmonic. There's a conflict here. So, being the good researcher that I am, I went to the greatest source that I know for Great Lakes people, and that is the Maritime Archive, the Great Lakes database at Bowling Green University. And you can search up people as well as vessels there. So I looked up both these names. Yes, there was a Captain Foote on board the Harmonic in 1913. And yes, there was a Captain Baird on board the Harmonic in 1913. I'm guessing they both weren't sailing her at the same time, or perhaps one was sailing as a mate and was still going with the title of captain. I don't know. And if they're both on there if they're both aboard at the same time, how did two captains see two different things? I have questions. Hopefully, at some point, we'll get an answer. Because so far to date, the Leafield has never been found. We're not going to answer that question until we know where the wreck is. But I got really, really excited when I saw this second news article with a whole different possibility. And then I started noticing that two captains, same boat. I have more research to do. About a year later, there's a message in a bottle picked up on the shore of Lake Superior, supposedly from the Leafield. And all it says is no hope. And on top of that, and people get excited, especially back then, messages in a bottle were not unheard of. In fact, a lot of ships, or most ships even in this era, carried a brass canister where the pilot house crew could put in the crew roster or a last message and throw it overboard. In 1913, you don't have standardized radio yet. Some ships had a wireless telegraph. It was not required on the Great Lakes. Many did not. So it was literally standard equipment for these vessels to have a brass bottle where a crew could send a last message overboard and hope someone found it on the beach. So people got excited when a bottle or when a message was found. It wasn't as far-fetched as it would seem in today's world. But the problem is it gives no details, and it was simply signed officer. I'm thinking if I'm on a sinking ship and this is my last note to let the world know what happened to me, I'm at least putting my name to prove that it's me. I don't think I would just sign an officer. The sad truth is, in my opinion, and take this for what it's worth, in my opinion, this is a hoax. And unfortunately, that was a very common thing. People would write hoax messages in bottles and set them adrift. Nowhere in this message is there any kind of detail that would tell me that this is legitimate. I could be wrong, but really it's the signature for me. If you just sign it without your name, if you had time to write officer, you had time to at least write your first name and people could compare it with the ship's roster. So I'm thinking this one's probably a hoax. I'm not quite done with the connections between these ships. So we got to go over to Europe here for a minute. Now, they are built essentially right next to each other. So if you think about the scale of the globe, I mean, this is just Europe. I've blown this up, very close in for my map purposes, but we have the Monkshaven is built in South Shields, England in 1882. The next one of these boats to be built is the Theano in Rotterdam, Netherlands in 1889. And then we have the Leafield in Sunderland, England in 1892. That's pretty close to each other where they're built. Now, keep in mind, When they come to the Great Lakes, they're sold as a lot, right? All four of these ships are sold together. So they travel over to the Great Lakes. They begin their careers on the Great Lakes together. Now let's look where they sink. You have the Monkshaven on Pye or Angus Island, whichever one you want to count as the official wrecking, but they're in the same area in 1905. You have the Theano on Trowbridge Island in 1906. And somewhere in that vicinity is the Leafield. Oh, by the way, they also sank in the same order that they were built. You really can't make this up. Sometimes truth is crazier than fiction. And when I realized, that's what got me started on this talk, was I knew about all three of these, and I knew all three had sank in roughly the same spot of Lake Superior coming from Europe. So I thought that was a pretty cool tie-in right there. I didn't realize just how tied together these ships were, right down to not only sinking in the same spot, but being built roughly in the same spot and being built and sinking in the same order. And when they sink, keep in mind, that's an 8-year span. It's not like they're all on making one trip up to Thunder Bay, Ontario and get caught in the same storm. This is over the course of 8 years. And look how close they are. Those are the three that sank. There's one survivor. I have one good story tonight. There's one survivor, and that's the fourth picture I had, the Paliki. She actually doesn't sink. The other three did. At this point, I don't think I'd sign on to sail on the Paliki. This might just be a good boat to stay off of. Right? Yeah, exactly. If she's scheduled to go from the Sioux to Thunder Bay, Ontario, nope. No thanks. I'm going home. Keep the winter bonus. I am not sailing it. She actually ends up getting sold back overseas, back to Europe, and she's ultimately scrapped in the 1930s. So there is one, or was one, survivor of these four, but this is one of those times where sometimes when I research a story to put together a presentation, it kind of plays out how I expect it to. This one just got crazier and crazier with all the tie-ins, and so I hope you enjoyed these stories. The Paliki kind of ends it, right? I mean, she survives, and we don't have a fifth one for me to talk about, but that is the really crazy tale of three ships that not only are really cool shipwreck stories, but the fact that they were tied in with so much American history at the same time, opening that competition in the steel industry and in the Industrial Revolution, and opening the Canadian iron ore industry. Just so many things that these ships were a part of. And I don't use the term historic often. Maybe I should as a history teacher, I don't know, but I don't use that word very often, but that's the word that kept coming to my mind as I did this research. Is these are ships that probably should have a bigger page in the history books with what they were a part of. But hopefully we at least got to keep their story alive a little bit tonight anyway. So, questions?
Yeah, is there something geologically contributing besides the storms in that particular area?
Is there something geologically contributing to the wrecks? Not really. Way back in the day, the iron ore ranges can mess with compasses. That is the thing. But really, it's just at that time period in the early 1900s. I mean, ships are really steering; they're navigating with a compass and a clock and a taffrail log, really, to measure RPMs and distance they may have traveled. They don't have AIS and all of this. You get off just a little bit, and in those storms, you're going to, Great Lakes storms, those waves, they're really close together, and they start kind of beating on that ship, and no wheelsman is going to maintain a perfect course. And with no visibility, it really is just kind of the storms.
How much distance was there between those islands, or how much wide is the passageway into Thunder Bay?
How much distance is between the islands? That I don't know for sure on the distance. But really what it boils down to is, again, in a storm, you can't see. You're at almost the most primitive navigational tool. If you are off 1 degree for a couple of hours, you're going to be several miles off course. So there's lots of room for ships to get through there in good weather or if they're on course. But if you're blinded in snow or in a storm and you can't see and you sailed 1 degree off course for 3-4 hours, that's really what it comes down to. It's just the inability to be super precise in your navigation.
This is size of the vessels.
The size of the vessels was roughly about 249 feet long. The Monkshaven was the longest one at about 257. So right in that 250-foot range, about 35, 36 feet wide. So relatively small ships.
So they didn't have a gyro like that.
The gyro, no.
So if you're running a magnetic compass and you got a load of steel on your ship,
Yes.
you may as well take the compass and go to the side.
And that's a good point too. They would have had binnacle compasses. So you would have had those iron balls on the side to
Yeah.
compensate. But and again, I'm not enough of a navigator to understand, but you've got the steel rails and you've got the iron ranges. Did they get to a point where they overloaded that compensation that they had? That's
I
a
wonder
possibility.
back then, did they have variation also on the charts then? Because true north is like where? Newfoundland or somewhere?
Yeah, you've got true north and magnetic north. I have a lot of stuff in my collection. I don't have a chart that old. I would have to look that one up. But yeah,
And at what point is can an outsider begin salvaging?
I'm sorry.
At what point can an outside company begin salvaging a wreck?
At what point can an outside company begin salvaging a wreck is whenever the owners and if there's an insurance underwriter, whenever they abandon it. So if they abandon it, anyone can go salvage it. Typically, like in the case of Monkshaven, the owners did not abandon it and they hired Tom Reed to come salvage it for them. So they didn't give up ownership of the vessel. They hired, kind of like hiring a tow truck when, you hit a deer,
But abandoning, I mean, what point is not when somebody is on the ship, is it they no longer want it?
Correct. So to abandon a ship, like when the Monkshaven went on the second island, they do a survey, they take a look at it and go, we can't save this, it's too damaged. And then they will officially abandon the vessel. And if somebody wants to try it, there's been a lot of cases where a ship has been abandoned and someone else has actually purchased the wreck and gone and salvaged it for themselves. So there's a couple scenarios there where someone else could purchase the wreck and go salvage it, and then a lot of times they'll fix it up and sail it as their own one boat fleet. But in cases like the Monkshaven, it was so battered by the second grounding that it wasn't financially reasonable to even try, and they just left it there.
That's pretty much what happened with the Ordinary then.
Yeah, it's pretty much what happened to the Norman Day, because with the Norman, you had 7 guys stayed on board to protect the salvage rights. And then the second storm came in and started breaking it up. And at that point, when the keel snapped and the Norman basically broke in half. She was already on the bottom, but she basically broke in half. And it just wasn't, it was going to cost more to fix it up and refloat it than the ship was really worth it that.
But the cargo was worth more than the ship.
The cargo was worth more than the ship on the Nordmere, so they did take the cargo out and then they just left the hull to kind of disintegrate over the years.
What was the cargo?
The cargo on the Nordmere?
Rolled steel, I think it was rolled.
There was rolled steel, there was plate steel. I think there was some other stuff too. Those ocean going ships, they really could carry a mixed cargo. It wasn't always a bulk cargo of just one commodity, but definitely steel was part of it.
It's kind of unbelievable, the value of a cargo, because when you read about the Puavi, it was loaded with copper. They said it was $1 million worth of copper. And that thing was smaller than that.
Yeah. The copper versus steel.
Yeah.
What did those type of, the sister ships in this one haul? Was it mostly Theano or?
Well, mostly in the early years, they were what they call tramp steamers. So before they came to the Great Lakes, they went port to port and pretty much hauled whatever they were hired to haul. You could think of them kind of like a floating UPS truck. Whatever anybody bought, they could carry. When they got into the transatlantic trade, it was mostly finished steel billets. And then here on the Great Lakes, it was iron ore, it was raw iron ore. And then they were hauling railroad rails up to Thunder Bay, or at that point, Fort William, Ontario, because that was when Canada was really expanding the railroad system west. And so you had the steel mills in Sioux, Ontario, who could make the rails, and then they would ship them up to Fort William, where they could continue making the tracks going westward. So it was a combination of railroad rails, finished steel, and iron ore by the time they finished their lives here on the lakes.
Did you designate that as a tramp?
Yes.
Yeah. Here in Snett had one. The Mitchell was designated as a tramp.
The Samuel Mitchell, yes. Most people forget about that one.
It was 1892, I think, though. I had a ride on it for a while. Not too big.
Not too long.
It was called a steam submarine. Because most of the time it was underwater.
I think I want to ride on a ship called the steam submarine. That doesn't sound comforting at all.
It's a good ride.
What was the tonnage on these ships?
The tonnage on this ship was, if I recall correctly, somewhere I think around 1,800, somewhere in there. They really truly were small ships. But when you think about what they were initially built for, being those tramp steamers, they were going into small ports and picking up. They weren't initially built to haul bulk cargoes. They even by the standards of their day, they were considered smaller ships.
They had a crew of,
Crew of about, well, the Leafield had a crew of 26, so somewhere mid-20s, 24, 27, somewhere in there. This time period in history, sailors were a very transient lot, so you might pull up to a dock and have a fireman just quit, and they might not always replace them right away. So crew rosters were always, there was some fluctuation. So I'll give you on a ballpark 25, 26 on an average for these ones.
the barge that the Leafield was towing. How long were they out there before they got back out to pick them up and move the Vegan for?
So the barge, the Leafield was pulling when she started to run. Like pull did not incur any injury, and by my best estimations, looked like probably about a day and a half before they got. By the time they got, including the time to go back out and get it, so they were probably anchored about a day and a half.
Yeah, I'm just picturing a barge, and they must have some kind of facility on the barge. Reason to that.
Yeah, so these barges were typically cut down schooners because we were reaching the era where steam was replacing sail. So they would take these wooden schooners that just couldn't compete with steamships. They would cut the masts off them, so you still had the cabins below decks for crew to sleep in, and so they could get out of the weather. They still had their crew quarters. They just couldn't really be powered by the wind. They would have, typically they leave a small mast for like a storm sail if they absolutely had to use it, but they couldn't really travel very far on their own anymore. But the crew definitely had quarters, so they left those in place.
It says there was 18 on the Leafield.
1800.
I'm Googling as you.
Okay.
1,450
Okay.
GRT.
Yeah, that's the gross tonnage. So then it's fun when you start looking at tonnages and whatnot, so you have gross tonnage and net tonnage and dead weight and.
I'm not trying to show you up.
No, you're fine. I tell people, I teach history, words are hard, numbers are harder, so. If I'm gonna get asked an engine question, it's gonna be from that guy, so I try to be prepared.
Yeah, if I think back in those days, they didn't run 3 watches, they ran 2. You were on 6 and off 6,
Yeah,
because I think the JB Ford was built a house at many.
Yeah.
Because we went we went with the 3 ship.
yeah, back when they did, you're right, they would run 2 watches, 6 and 6, and then we got away from that because we started having some accidents where people were falling asleep in the wheelhouse.
Oh, that was against the rules.
Only against the rules, you hit something you're not supposed to. You stay floating for 6 hours of sleeping, you're fine.
But are there commercial ships are still powered by coal?
There is one commercial ship still powered by coal, and that would be the car ferry SS Badger out of Wellington. Yep, and so they tried to shut her down, and by they I mean the competition out of Muskegon. But there's a slight problem with that. So the Badger is actually on the National Register of Historic Places, and it's also part of the federal highway system. She is actually part of Highway 10 or US 10. So what they did have to do eventually is they had to put in a container system to catch the coal ash. So when she docks in Weddington, they'll unload the cars. And you'll see a couple of people drive forklifts on there to grab these big stainless steel containers. And they take the ash out, and they run it up to Charleroi, and they use it in the cement making process. There is one left, and it's the Badger.
What they do in the old days, just dump it on the lake.
In the old days, the coal ash would just get tossed overboard, and it would just go to the bottom of the lake. Yep. Yep. So, but yeah, the company out of Muskegon, they learned it's a lot more complicated to shut down your competition when they're part of the federal highway system. Because otherwise, US 10 is going to have a big gap in the middle of it. Any other questions? Thank you.